truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Thursday, May 2nd, 2024, the 1198th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm hello and welcome to all of you listening ad-free through a paid subscription on Substack at imyourmoderator.substack.com. With your paid subscription, you are also able to join the members-only live stream each and every Wednesday afternoon. You can become a paid subscriber for $50 a year or $5 a month, and in doing so, you will be supporting me, the work I do, and this show as it expands. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening with a free subscription on a wide variety of podcast platforms. And of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. So on Monday, we discussed some of the lawfare and litigation around election issues, not only from the past, but looking ahead to this election that is scheduled for November 5th of this year. And so let's begin there with this article from USA Today. U.S. Appeals Court will not rehear case over Pennsylvania mail-in ballots. Will SCOTUS take it on? A federal appeals court has refused to revisit its ruling over mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania, leaving the U.S. Supreme Court as the next possible stop for a case that originated in Erie and could influence the outcome of the 2024 presidential election. And so already the framing is improper. The framing biases you toward thinking that this entire effort, this litigation, is all about applying some sort of undue influence on the upcoming election and not actually straightening out legal issues that are being exploited with the clear intent and an obvious history of actually influencing and rigging elections. The Pennsylvania-based Third U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals has declined to reconsider its March 27th ruling that election officials in Pennsylvania are barred from counting mail-in ballots that arrive in time but that have inaccurate dates or no dates handwritten on their exterior envelopes. So the courts support the idea that ballots that go undated, mail-in ballots that go undated, cannot be counted as lawful, legitimate ballots and added into the final vote total as they have been in the past. This isn't some radical decision. It is just a confirmation that states actually have to follow their own election laws. And they can't just count unlawful votes on the justification that not doing so would actually constitute voter suppression. Counting unlawful votes as though they were lawful votes is actual voter suppression. It cancels out real lawful votes. The 2-1 decision by a 3-judge panel reversed a November 21st decision by U.S. District Judge Susan Paradise Baxter of the Erie Division of the Pittsburgh-based U.S. District Court for the Western District of Pennsylvania. Baxter held that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 requires election officials to count mail-in ballots without dates or accurate dates handwritten on their exterior envelopes if the ballots are received on time. The Pennsylvania State Conference of the NAACP and other civil rights groups sued before Baxter in 2022 to challenge the Pennsylvania law that requires the invalidation of mail-in ballots due to misdated or undated forms. After those groups won, the RNC appealed Baxter's decision, sending the case to the circuit court. Following the Third Circuit panel's decision, the NAACP and other groups on April 10th petitioned the circuit court to rehear the case before a panel or the full 14-judge court. Only 4 of the judges voted for a rehearing, leading the circuit court to deny the request, according to a one-line order docketed on Tuesday. They note that the ACLU, who is leading the litigation, is considering whether or not to appeal this up to the Supreme Court. The article says the case hinges on what is known as the materiality provision of the Civil Rights Act. The provision prohibits states from disqualifying voters who fail to provide unnecessary information on a voting application or ballot. In her decision, Baxter found that election officials do not use the date on the outer envelope of a mail-in ballot to determine whether to count a vote. Baxter said officials know when a mail-in ballot is returned by scanning a barcode on the return envelope. On appeal, the majority of the Third Circuit panel acknowledged that the date requirement serves little apparent purpose, but the majority said the materiality provision does not override Pennsylvania law that, quote, undated or misdated ballots are invalid. A then Republican-controlled General Assembly passed Act 77, the state law that authorized mail-in ballots in 2019, and it took effect in 2020. Now, if you go back to Act 77, you will find quite a bit of controversy. It was passed in a bipartisan manner, which should only be seen now as a unipartisan manner in Pennsylvania, a state with incredible election rigging. Act 77 was initially overturned in Pennsylvania courts, then it was appealed and upheld. But let's go back to the Philadelphia Inquirer, January 28, 2022. A Pennsylvania court overturned the state's mail voting law, but an appeal means it's still in place. And as I said, that appeal actually upheld Act 77. But as with all of these years-old election-related issues, we have not heard the end of them. From the article, Democrats believe the Supreme Court, and this is the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which has a Democrat majority, will uphold the law. So they were relying on a Democrat majority Supreme Court to uphold Act 77 on appeal. This was passed with a Republican majority General Assembly in unipartisan fashion. Democrats had feared for months that the state's Commonwealth Court, with its Republican majority, would strike down Act 77. Pennsylvania's illegitimate governor and former Attorney General Josh Shapiro was very confident that Act 77 was A-OK, which is strange, isn't it, that someone like Josh Shapiro would be so supportive of a law passed with a Republican majority General Assembly. Crazy, huh? Back to the article in the Philadelphia Inquirer. The court notably did not rule against the merits of all mail voting and its expansion. It focused instead on how that expansion occurred, saying the Constitution must first be amended to allow it. No excuse mail-in voting makes the exercise of the franchise more convenient and has been used 4 times in the history of Pennsylvania, Judge Mary Hannah Leavitt wrote for the court. Approximately 1.38 million voters have expressed their interest in voting by mail permanently. If presented to the people, a constitutional amendment is likely to be adopted. But a constitutional amendment must be presented to the people before legislation like Act 77 can take effect. So that was the judge's decision, making it clear how election law can be changed in Pennsylvania, and having the General Assembly simply pass legislation rather than amending the Pennsylvania Constitution is not how to properly change Pennsylvania election law. Back to the Inquirer. Act 77 was negotiated by Republican legislative leaders and Democrat Governor Tom Wolf and was passed with widespread bipartisan support in 2019. It was the largest change to Pennsylvania election law in generations. And courts have ruled, not all courts, but some courts have ruled, that that was unconstitutional. Imagine pushing through in unipartisan fashion the greatest changes to a state's election law in generations and not making sure that the constitutionality of those changes was airtight. In addition to the massive expansion of mail voting, the law extended the voter registration deadline from 30 days before Election Day to 15. And it removed the straight ticket option that allowed voters to vote once for a political party and have that choice apply to every race on the ballot. By overturning the law in its entirety, the ruling would roll back all those changes. The decision was 3-2, with 3 Republican judges striking the law over the dissent of 2 Democrat judges. I would also call your attention to the judge noting that 1.38 million Pennsylvanians have expressed their desire to be placed on the permanent mail-in ballot list. I would think that claim needs to be investigated a little further. I believe they could probably say that in California as well, because the California Secretary of State simply changed everyone's registration to permanent mail-in voting and left it for the voters to opt out of that. So if you then go ahead and say that whoever didn't opt out then necessarily wants to be on the permanent mail-in ballot list, well, that's not exactly describing the situation very honestly. The same explanation may apply in Pennsylvania as well. But back to USA Today. The Third Circuit's ruling will remain law unless the Supreme Court rules otherwise. The decision has heightened awareness of the rules for mail-in ballots in Pennsylvania, considered a swing state in the presidential race. 1 million voters used mail-in ballots in the November 2022 election, and 10,000 of those ballots were not counted because of problems with the dating requirements, even though the ballots were returned in time. Now, all of this is going to intersect Moore versus Harper, the decision made at the Supreme Court in 2023. Wikipedia summarizes the decision this way. Moore versus Harper is the decision that rejected the independent state legislature theory, a theory that asserts state legislatures have the sole authority to establish election laws for federal elections within their respective states, and this is the key part, without judicial review by state courts, without presentment to state governors, and without constraint by state constitutions. The Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the Elections Clause does not give state legislatures sole power over elections, rejecting the independent state legislature theory. So what that means is that state legislatures can pass election laws, but those changes still have to be sent to the governor for review. They have to pass judicial muster, which means that the courts are able to weigh in on the constitutionality of any of those changes, and any changes they make are constrained by a state's constitution. So we'll have to keep an eye on the appeals process for this decision. We will see if they try to take this all the way up to the Supreme Court. The court's ruling on Moore versus Harper says that the General Assembly's passage of Act 77 is absolutely subject to judicial review for its constitutionality, and one would think that they might weigh in favor of the idea that states actually have to enforce their own election laws in order for an election to be lawful and certifiable. And of course, Pennsylvania's haven't been in a very long time. Donald Trump had a day off yesterday from filming Law and Order New York, the loudest hush money episode, though he is back on set today. Yesterday, he was flying around to Wisconsin, a couple stops in Wisconsin, and then to Michigan, doing more campaign events in front of more people in one day than Joe Biden will probably do for this entire campaign cycle. At his stop in Michigan yesterday, he had this to say.
We're not going to allow them to rig the presidential election, the most important day of our lives in 2024. We're not going to allow it. We're going to protect the vote, and I'm pleased to, this is the first time I've announced this, actually, announced that our campaign is going to be leading a historic effort in conjunction with the RNC, that's Republican National Committee, the state parties, and a team of the most highly qualified lawyers and other professionals in the country to ensure that what happened in 2020 will never happen again. We're not going to allow it to happen again. The only good thing about 2020, it showed how bad they are. It showed what a rotten job they do. That's why we're more popular now than we were 4 years ago. No matter how you vote, whether it's early on election day, by mail or in person, it doesn't matter. We'll make sure your ballot is secure. We want to make you sure, but we're going to be sure that your ballot's secure. You're not going to put in ballots that don't count. You're not going to put in and do things. You're not going to have other people not there, but putting in a ballot. Like a couple of cases that you happen to hear about. I'm sure you heard about a little place called Detroit, right? Where they had more ballots than they had voters. A little thing like that. And then by the time the people got screamed at all night, they sort of said, oh, they were called every name under the book. And they sort of said, oh, but they had, think of it, they had more ballots than they had voters. We're not going to let it happen again. And you have to be very vigilant, too, because you can see it. You see it happening better than anybody else. It's really a source. We're going to watch the radical left Democrat like hawks. All these Democrats we're going to watch like hawks because, honestly, I don't like saying this. They cheat like hell. They cheat like hell. In plenty of other places, too. And we're going to make America great again. It's very simple. We're going to make our country great again.
So I believe Trump is referring to an RNC effort that was announced a couple of weeks back. This is the press release at GOP.com. Trump campaign and RNC unveil historic 100,000-person strong election integrity program. In a historic move to safeguard the integrity of the electoral process, the Trump campaign and the RNC announced the launch of the most extensive and monumental election integrity program in the nation's history. RNC Chairman Michael Whatley, co-chair Laura Trump, and Chief Counsel Charlie Spies, together with the campaign, designed this new program to have over 100,000 dedicated volunteers and attorneys deployed across every battleground state as part of the RNC's commitment to ensuring transparency and fairness in the 2024 elections. Why aren't they in every state? If you want to tell me every state's a battleground state and you're putting people in every state, cool. But the idea that only battleground states are of concern is preposterous. Whenever a ballot is counted or being cast, Republican poll watchers will be observing the process and reporting any irregularity. In the event of an irregularity or problem, RNC lawyers and the volunteer attorneys that they have coordinated will provide rapid response services to resolve the issue using a sophisticated, tested action protocol. And I guess we're just going to have to trust them on that. Partnered alongside the efforts of grassroots supporters and legal experts, the program is establishing a robust network of monitoring and protection against any violation or fraud. This groundbreaking initiative underscores the unwavering commitment of the RNC and the Trump campaign to protect the election. To empower poll watchers, poll workers, and attorneys, comprehensive training sessions will be conducted every month on the monitoring of not only voting sites, but also ballot tabulation centers. These trainings will equip volunteers with the necessary knowledge and skills to effectively oversee potential problems in the electoral process, guaranteeing that every vote is counted accurately and fairly. You really do have to wonder where they are on actually contesting the elections that have already been stolen. There are 5 areas of observation where we will guarantee coverage, and aggressive attorneys will be engaged at all these stages to stop Democrat attempts to circumvent rules. Here are the 5 areas: logic and accuracy machine testing, early voting, election day voting, mail-in ballot processing, both adjudication and duplication. Post-election, they will focus on canvass, audits, and recounts. So they are going to keep a close eye on every element of the thoroughly rigged election system that is itself incapable of producing accurate and reliable results. Now, if you want to tell me that they're putting all of this out there to accurately record each and every bit of fraud produced by this system as part of a massive sting operation to fully expose this problem to the country, I'll say, okay, well, I guess that sounds kind of good. But first, you have to convince me that the man who is already a duly elected president and is running against a man who is an illegitimate president are having a real campaign in the first place. Then you'll have to explain to me how that was what happened in 2020 and beyond, and it still has to happen again. We still have to use this illegitimate system again, because that's the only way everyone will understand it. And if you want to do that, I can accept that answer. I think there is a chance that that is what is happening. But it really is not our responsibility as the people of America, the men and women of this country, the people who this government should be of, by, and for. It is not our duty or our responsibility to sit around clapping for a sting operation, knowing that we don't have legitimate elections. Now, if that's the solution, you can allow the people who are enacting that solution to pursue that solution. We should be focused on letting people know that up until now, our elections have not been legitimate. The government that is putting these rules and regulations and laws in place that guide and control our lives, they're not legitimate. Therefore, the legislation itself is not legitimate. And then we have to break through the issue of why, if the people running these systems and Republicans generally are the good guys, we are being told that to be good guys ourselves, we need to support them as they lie to us and then, quote unquote, elect them using a rigged system that is specifically designed to generate election outcomes that have already been chosen by the regime. Now, Donald Trump himself says that he is going to make sure they are not able to rig the presidential election. Now, is Trump just saying presidential election, meaning this general election on November 5th? Maybe that is what he is saying. Maybe that is what he means. And maybe he's saying that none of it will be rigged. But what he said was the presidential election. And if the presidential election somehow goes unrigged, that is virtually meaningless to us. The narrative in 6 months will not be able to support anything other than a Trump win. So Trump being announced the winner by then will be a foregone conclusion. To announce any winner other than Trump would be to expose the entire system, and that may well be why it happens. It is necessary to recognize that possibility. But if Trump is announced as the winner and the rest of the election is rigged, then our government will not be any more legitimate than it is right now. And we will have no reason to trust the legitimacy of Donald Trump's election if all the elections down ballot are rigged. You cannot produce a legitimate system through illegitimate means. It's not possible. The worst possible outcome would be for Donald Trump to be announced the winner of the presidential race, then for us to be told that Democrats dominated down ballot because the centrist voters wanted a balanced government. They wanted a check on Donald Trump's power, but also wanted Donald Trump back since Joe Biden was so bad. We should all be easily able to imagine that happening. And if and when that does happen, Uniparty right normies and even many committed Trump supporters who imagine themselves to be awake will simply go back to their normal lives and check out. Donald Trump's back. We're all saved. That's all that needed to happen. And then we have a complete and total subversion throughout the House and the Senate, within state governments, all the way down to the county, city, town, local level, school boards, all the rest of it. Now, I'm not saying this to doom out. It's entirely possible that under that scenario, we can still accomplish whatever we need to accomplish. But if that's possible, it will all be met with maximum resistance, and we will be told 24 hours a day by the media that the American people wanted the Democrats there to thwart the implementation of Trump's agenda, that the American people don't actually want Trump to clean out the administrative state and tear down the federal bureaucracy. That is what we will be told with divided government. So I'm glad Trump's out there talking about this, and I'm glad he's expressing confidence. But figuring out a pathway to getting the TV to announce that Donald Trump has won the election is not what is going to save this country, especially not if you want to keep things, generally speaking, the way they are now in terms of governmental structures and whatnot. Now, on the flip side of that, the media has once again started up one of their tired old refrains about accepting the results of the election. You'll remember in 2016, Trump was asked if he would accept the results of the election. He said, yeah, if I win. And of course, we had the same scenario in 2020. My friend Patriots in Control on Telegram today put together one of those collages of mainstream media headlines. They did this same sort of struggle session over accepting the election outcomes to Kerry Lake in the 2022 midterms. They've done it to Donald Trump plenty of times, and they're doing it to him again. This is from last night in the New York Times. Trump repeating 2020 election lies, will not commit to accepting 2024 results. And what kind of responsible, patriotic American would commit to accepting 2024 results? Even if you are not fully convinced that 2020 was an illegitimate election, and if you're not fully convinced, you're either lying or utterly retarded. But even as an evil retard, you should understand that there's no reason to be convinced right now that we're going to have a legitimate election in 2024. I mean, it's one thing to lie about something from a few years ago that you believe the population by and large has gotten over. It's another thing to set yourself up to be a liar again. The election system as it exists is designed not to produce legitimate outcomes. It is designed to choose the winners of elections. So saying in advance that you're going to trust the system is insane, especially from someone on the inside who understands how the system works, like President Trump. Former President Donald Trump told the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel on Wednesday that he would not commit to accepting the results of the 2024 election, as he again repeated his lies that the 2020 election was stolen from him. If everything's honest, I'll gladly accept the results. I don't change on that, Trump said, according to the Journal-Sentinel. If it's not, you have to fight for the right of the country. Exactly right. This is exactly what he should be saying. In an interview with Time magazine published Tuesday, he also dismissed questions about political violence in November by suggesting that his victory was inevitable. And of course, it is inevitable. And the people on the other side already know that. When pressed about what might happen should he lose, he said, if we don't win, it depends. It always depends on the fairness of an election. Trump's insistent and fraudulent claims, Oh, Trump's claims are fraudulent. Got it. Why is the New York Times trying to condemn Trump's insistence, by the way? If you are a president and an election is stolen from you, insistence is your job and duty. For the rest of your life, you should be talking about that stolen election, as should everyone who knows the election was stolen. But we sure don't have too many people who do that, do we? What does that say about society? And you gotta ask yourself, I know my listeners are pretty good, and I'm probably preaching to the choir, especially for paid subscribers, but why in the world are people still paying attention to media figures who have lied about our elections and Joe Biden's legitimacy for the last 3.5 years? How much leeway will you give these people? Trump's insistent and fraudulent claims that the 2020 election was unfair were at the heart of his efforts to overturn his loss to President Joe Biden and to the violent storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2021, by a mob of supporters who believed his claims. Trump now faces dozens of felony charges in connection with those events. Trump's vow to fight for the right of the country also echoes his speech on the ellipse on January 6th, where he told his supporters that, quote, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore, end quote, before urging his supporters to march to the Capitol. Ah, yes, Trump saying that he's going to fight against stolen elections is exactly like violence on January 6th. The very violent insurrection, always the promise of more violence if the results of elections are not widely accepted by Trump and MAGA. And considering that we're not the ones who are ever talking about violence or promoting violence, you might actually wonder if this is just a threat. And of course it is. As he campaigns in battleground states this year, Trump has repeatedly tried to sow doubt about the integrity of the fall election, while repeating many of the same lies that he used to assail the integrity of the 2020 election. Months before any voting has taken place, Trump has regularly made the baseless claim that Democrats are likely to cheat to win. Well, no, it's not just Democrats, it's the Uniparty. It is true, though, that there is no way the Democrats can win without cheating. Democrats have cheated in elections for as long as there have been elections. These are reporters at our supposed paper of record who believe that all of Trump's election claims have simply been debunked, and there's just nothing more to it. We've written articles that say those claims are debunked. Aside from a statement from Chris Krebs, a statement from Bill Barr, and a total misunderstanding of what happened in the courts, that's all they have to go on in order to support Joe Biden's legitimacy or the legitimacy of any of the rest of our governmental officials, not to mention all of the mainstream media. The article goes on to make sure that you have been exposed to every one of the slogans within the official story about Trump's past election claims and how Trump and everyone around him is being prosecuted for making these claims that led to the very violent insurrection. These are all the people who are tearing down our democracy, and there's nothing to any of it. Honestly, they go on for like another 1,000 words of just that. More and more, these articles sound like they are just simply written by AI all the time. And of course, because I said that, I had to go into the New York Times article and click on the author's names. This is one of them. His name is Michael Gold. He joined the New York Times politics desk last fall. There is a photo of him in their announcement. Here is some of that announcement. It goes without saying that for much of the past year, Michael has, with Grace Ashford, utterly owned the George Santos saga, a story that they broke and then dominated, delivering scoop after scoop, laden with the kind of delicious details you couldn't possibly make up. On our team, Michael will do double duty, applying a marathoner's stamina to the role of road warrior as he follows Donald Trump and other candidates on the trail, but also bringing his speed, smarts, and wit and his writing flair to our breaking news operation, giving it a powerful boost as the cycle heats up. Everywhere he's been, Michael has made a mark, As a breaking news reporter for Metro, he brilliantly covered everything from crime to pride with a capital P. Wrote countless snappy and informative explainers, documented natural and unnatural phenomena, and pondered if Happy the elephant was truly happy. He's also, quote, written an embarrassing amount about Jennifer Lopez for this newspaper, end quote, Michael acknowledged. But we all have to be experts in something, he said. And for evidence of his ability to hatch a fun idea and then carry it through to execution, check out his New Year's Eve COVID story, written in the form of a countdown. But let's keep going. So, Trump may not accept the results of an election that is definitely going to be rigged. That is, I guess, a bad thing. And when that happens, Trump is also going to promote violence, even though political violence is the Uniparty thing. That is a regime thing. That is not a MAGA thing. It's not an America First thing. It's not a Trump thing. But here is MSNBC's Donnie Deutsch losing his mind on Morning Joe.
Donald Trump and people around him are figuring out how to subvert democracy if he doesn't win. And let me say that slowly, so his apologists who will write this in an op-ed laughing, oh, they're saying Donald Trump. No, Donald Trump's own words say. They don't suggest, they say he will subvert democracy if he doesn't win. And if he does win, it'll be worse. Yeah. He will subvert democracy more. He will fire prosecutors who will not arrest his political opponents. He said it.
He says what he's going to do. What he's going to do, to your point, Joe, is have the FCC report to him so he will be able to control shows like this. He wants the FTC to report to him. He wants to bring the Insurrection Act back so he can turn military troops on his own people. He wants to weaponize, as you said, the Justice Department to go after his enemies. He wants to put women on a registry in red states for abortion.
Monitor.
That's if he wins.
So, what you just said, somebody out in the Trump sort of stratosphere will put on a website and say, look at Donnie Deutsch freaking out, right? And that's their ploy. That's the lie. And I will say, I love the Wall Street Journal editorial page. I disagree with them a lot, but they will have people like writing op-eds that would take what you just said and lie to their readers. They lie to their readers and say, look at the media. And I've read more of this. The media going, are being hyperbolic. No, all you're doing is repeating his words. When we repeat his words, the Trump right and the Trump media will say, Donnie's losing his mind. They have Trump derangement syndrome.
I deal with it every day.
But what did you just do?
I just used his words. Again, I just talked about if he wins. If he loses, he will tell people to take to the streets with violence. He's telling you.
Well,
he's telling us. So if he wins, we're in trouble. Yeah. If he loses, we're in trouble.
That's what
So yes, I'm going to tell you that they're melting down, they're panicking, they're losing their minds because they are melting down, panicking, and losing their minds. Now, it's possible that everyone in the cast of Morning Joe exists in a tiny little bubble, and all they know about the real world is what they say to each other and what they read on censored social media platforms. Their rationale that excuses them from claims of melting down or panicking is that they're just saying what Donald Trump is saying. Donald Trump says he's going to do certain things. They believe that he's going to do those things, whether he wins or not, apparently. And because Trump says these things, that means they're not melting down. The idea is that they are somehow channeling the public sentiment about Trump's words and about his potential actions, and they are representing it. They are telling these brave, bold truths about what is going to happen when Trump wins a third term. Except the thing is, nobody agrees with these people anymore. By and large, people want Donald Trump to go in there and clean out the administrative state and fix our elections and take us out of these fake foreign proxy wars. What Donald Trump is selling does not sound like a threat to the American people. It only sounds like a threat to people like Donnie Deutsch and Joe Scarborough and all of those people who continue to support the Uniparty because they still comply with the incentive and punishment structure within the party of false decorum, or they've just checked out completely. But a lot of people, especially ones who are wannabe elites and have maybe made some compromises in their lives to continue climbing that ladder within the party of false decorum, trading favors, doing things they shouldn't do, involving themselves in corruption, having questionable moral lives that are then used to compromise them. If Trump comes back and elections are fixed, all of these people are toast, because their ability to remain in power goes away, and their ability to have laws that are written to help them remain in power goes away. And in that scenario, the people in power would be tasked with holding all of these people accountable. And that's kind of the whole point. It sounds like they are starting to realize that whether Trump wins or loses, they're screwed. And so, yeah, they're panicking, they're melting down, they're losing their minds. So we have the New York Times piece fretting about Trump saying that he wouldn't accept the results of the election if the results of that election are not reliable, if the election is not fairly held, if it is rigged as the rest of our elections are rigged. And then they worry about violence because they believe that Trump is hinting at it himself. And that is rooted in this Time magazine feature that was written about Donald Trump this week. It is part of the Donnie Deutsch freakout you just heard, and it has created quite the buzz this week. The article is called How Far Trump Would Go, and it's by a man named Eric Cortellessa. Cortellessa was educated at Northwestern University's School of Journalism. He has written for The Washington Post, The Nation, Slate, and The New Republic, all of those popular leftist outlets. He has a couple more on his resume as well. But let's go to the article. And this is a long piece, but I want to get through a big chunk of it, if not all of it. Donald Trump thinks he's identified a crucial mistake of his first term. He was too nice. We've been talking for more than an hour on April 12th at his fever dream palace in Palm Beach. Aides lurk around the perimeter of a gilded dining room overlooking the manicured lawn. When one nudges me to wrap up the interview, I bring up the many former cabinet officials who refuse to endorse Trump this time. Some have publicly warned that he poses a danger to the republic. Why should voters trust you, I ask, when some of the people who observed you most closely do not? As always, Trump punches back, denigrating his former top advisors. But beneath the typical torrent of invective, there is a larger lesson he has taken away. I let them quit because I have a heart. I don't want to embarrass anybody, Trump says. I don't think I'll do that again. From now on, I'll fire. 6 months from the 2024 presidential election, Trump is better positioned to win the White House than at any point in either of his previous campaigns. He leads Joe Biden by slim margins in most polls, including in several of the 7 swing states likely to determine the outcome. But I had not come to ask about the election, the disgrace that followed the last one, or how he has become the first former and perhaps future American president to face a criminal trial. I wanted to know what Trump would do if he wins a second term, to hear his vision for the nation in his own words. What emerged in 2 interviews with Trump and conversations with more than a dozen of his closest advisors and confidants were the outlines of an imperial presidency that would reshape America and its role in the world. To carry out a deportation operation designed to remove more than 11 million people from the country, Trump told me. He would be willing to build migrant detention camps and deploy the U.S. military, both at the border and inland. He would let red states monitor women's pregnancies and prosecute those who violate abortion bans. He would, at his personal discretion, withhold funds appropriated by Congress, according to his top advisors. He would be willing to fire a U.S. attorney who doesn't carry out his order to prosecute someone, breaking with a tradition of independent law enforcement that dates from America's founding. He is weighing pardons for every one of his supporters accused of attacking the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, more than 800 of whom have pleaded guilty or been convicted by a jury. He might not come to the aid of an attacked ally in Europe or Asia if he felt that country wasn't paying enough for its own defense. He would gut the U.S. Civil Service, deploy the National Guard to American cities as he sees fit, close the White House Pandemic Preparedness Office, and staff his administration with acolytes who back his false assertion that the 2020 election was stolen. Now, this writer thinks that all of this represents some kind of insane authoritarian dictatorship. This is following and upholding the law based on an extensive evidentiary record proving the necessity of all of these things. None of this is out of bounds in any way. They've been running a slave trade. That needs to be dealt with. Thus, the deportations. The facilities they would be using have already been built because that is how they are facilitating bringing these people in. The military absolutely can be used to deal with an invasion of this country, so there's nothing wrong there. Red states monitoring women's pregnancies and prosecuting them when they violate the law to terminate their fetuses? What do you expect to happen? Trump mentioned in his speech yesterday the impoundment powers that he has. That is what this writer is talking about when he mentions Trump restricting the use of funds that have already been appropriated. We are seeing some of that happening right now. The illegitimate Congress attempting to pass spending packages, including funding the Ukraine effort for the next 10 years. They want to put all of these appropriations in place so that Donald Trump's hands are tied, so that the country keeps sending out this money, despite the fact that they have rejected all of this illegitimate government and brought Trump in to reverse everything they've done and fix the problems they've created. The writer complains about breaking the tradition of the president remaining independent from the law enforcement mechanisms of the executive branch, but we can see that that's already broken. Donald Trump will be held morally responsible for something Joe Biden is doing because from this communist's perspective, Donald Trump is the one who has broken the law. Therefore, the fake president's political persecutions and prosecutions are totally justified. Weighing pardons for the very violent insurrection, obviously something that has to happen. Refusing to be false flagged into a world war by ignoring NATO's Article 5 for countries that don't bother paying? Sounds good. Better? Just end NATO. Yes, of course, gut the civil service. Having the National Guard in the streets is not ideal, but it's better than a lot of what we're dealing with now. We can table that one. As for ending the Pandemic Preparedness Office, that is an obvious one. Does anyone really believe in pandemics anymore? And of course, the 2020 election was rigged. Why would Trump ever shy away from hiring people who believed that? In fact, Trump should not hire anyone who doesn't loudly and clearly affirm that our elections are stolen. The fact that that is not yet the obvious public standard is not great, to be honest. So this communist has really set the tone. Let's get back to the article. Trump remains the same guy with the same goals and grievances. But in person, if anything, he appears more assertive and confident. When I first got to Washington, I knew very few people, he says. I had to rely on people. Now he is in charge. The arranged marriage with the timorous Republican Party stalwarts is over. The old guard is vanquished, and the people who remain are his people. Trump would enter a second term backed by a slew of policy shops staffed by loyalists who have drawn up detailed plans in service of his agenda, which would concentrate the powers of the state in the hands of a man whose appetite for power appears all but insatiable. I don't think it's a big mystery what his agenda would be, says his close advisor, Kellyanne Conway, but I think people will be surprised at the alacrity with which he will take action. But to be clear, there is no support in Conway's quote for what this writer just suggested, that Donald Trump's appetite for power appears to be insatiable. That is a baseless claim for which there is no evidence. Donald Trump knew that the election was rigged and stolen in 2020 and he walked away in order to avoid the chaos that would have erupted otherwise. Trump is not pursuing power insatiably. The people want Donald Trump to come back as the publicly recognized president. The people want Donald Trump in power. Back to the article. The court, the Constitution, and a Congress of unknown composition would all have a say in whether Trump's objectives come to pass. The machinery of Washington has a range of defenses, leaks to a free press, whistleblower protections, the oversight of inspectors general. The same deficiencies of temperament and judgment that hindered him in the past remain present. If he wins, Trump would be a lame duck. Contrary to the suggestions of some supporters, he tells Time he would not seek to overturn or ignore the Constitution's prohibition on a third term. Public opinion would also be a powerful check. Amid a popular outcry, Trump was forced to scale back some of his most draconian first-term initiatives, including the policy of separating migrant families. As George Orwell wrote in 1945, the ability of governments to carry out their designs, quote, depends on the general temper in the country, end quote. This writer is obviously lost deep within a total inversion. This is absolutely backwards. Every election is billed as a national turning point. This time, that rings true. To supporters, the prospect of Trump 2.0, unconstrained and backed by a disciplined movement of true believers, offers revolutionary promise. To much of the rest of the nation and the world, it represents an alarming risk. A second Trump term could bring, quote, the end of our democracy, says presidential historian Douglas Brinkley, and the birth of a new kind of authoritarian presidential order. So Douglas Brinkley is a regime presidential historian. He appears all the time on MSNBC. We are being told that much of the nation, and beyond that, much of the world, does not want to see Trump come back. Well, first off, what the rest of the world doesn't matter. I don't think it's accurately represented by this writer, but it doesn't matter. Why would we care who the rest of the world wants us to choose as president? That doesn't mean anything at all. If much of the rest of the nation doesn't want that, well, let's get some legitimate elections in place and find out whether or not that's so, and just how much of the rest of the nation actually represents. Because it's not more than half, and if it's not more than half, you're going to have a real hard time making arguments in favor of your support for democracy while trying to delegitimize Trump before he even wins. There is nothing about Donald Trump carrying out the will of the American people who elect him that would be suggestive of an all-new kind of authoritarian presidential order. It's insane. Trump steps onto the patio at Mar-a-Lago near dusk. The well-heeled crowd eating Wagyu steaks and grilled bronzino pauses to applaud as he takes his seat. On this gorgeous evening, the club is a MAGA mecca. Billionaire donor Steve Wynn is here. So is Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, who is dining with the former president after a joint press conference proposing legislation to prevent non-citizens from voting. Their voting in federal elections is already illegal and extremely rare, but remains a Trumpian fixation that the embattled speaker appeared happy to co-sign in exchange for the political cover that standing with Trump provides, and it has provided him very little cover. At the moment, though, Trump's attention is elsewhere. With an index finger, he swipes through an iPad on the table to curate the restaurant soundtrack. The playlist veers from Sinead O'Connor to James Brown to The Phantom of the Opera. And there's a uniquely Trump choice, a rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner sung by a choir of defendants imprisoned for attacking the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, interspersed with a recording of Trump reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. This has become a staple of his rallies, converting the ultimate symbol of national unity into a weapon of factional devotion. It's funny how the communists take a general concept, they invert its meaning in order to make that concept divisive. Then they project to the world that the new meaning of the concept is all there ever was and all there ever will be, and that everyone basically supports that new meaning, except for those awful people who want to drag us back to those terrible times in history where it meant the other thing. Then, when that small group of people remembers the real meaning of the concept and they start talking about it, and other people are like, oh yeah, that is what that meant. Why are we believing that this thing means the opposite of what it's supposed to mean? Like right now, patriotism, for instance. To these people, patriotism means that you want to preserve our democracy worldwide. You are helping in the cause of keeping the United States in its position among the global regime as they implement the one world liberal international rules-based order. They make a requirement of patriotism to actually be a globalist, which is the polar opposite, the total inversion of patriotism. So they invert the meaning, they create the divide, and then when they realize that they have lost the narrative tug of rope going on, then they say that the other side, who is bringing back the original meaning of a given concept, they are creating the division. Always the inversion. The spectacle picks up where his first term left off. The events of January 6th, during which a pro-Trump mob attacked the center of American democracy in an effort to subvert the peaceful transfer of power, was a profound stain on his legacy. Trump has sought to recast the insurrectionist riot as an act of patriotism. I call them the J6 Patriots, he says. When I ask whether he would consider pardoning every one of them, he says yes, absolutely. As Trump faces dozens of felony charges, including for election interference, conspiracy to defraud the United States, willful retention of national security secrets, and falsifying business records to conceal hush money payments, he has tried to turn legal peril into a badge of honor. Because it's political persecution. Because the fake indictments are being tried in kangaroo courts. Because all of it is happening to convince the American public that Donald Trump could never be reelected president for the third term. And because the illegitimate president and his illegitimate administration are the driving force behind the fake indictments, breaking all of the norms this commie just mentioned not too long ago. In a second term, Trump's influence on American democracy would extend far beyond pardoning powers. Allies are laying the groundwork to restructure the presidency in line with a doctrine called the unitary executive theory, which holds that many of the constraints imposed on the White House by legislators and the courts should be swept away in favor of a more powerful commander-in-chief. And of course, the communist frames this in a way that would support his notion that Donald Trump wants unconstrained power, that all of this is about Trump gaining more power. This is what Wikipedia has to say about unitary executive theory, and I encourage you to look into this on your own and see where you come down on the issue. The unitary executive theory is a legal theory in United States constitutional law, which holds that the President of the United States possesses the power to control the entire executive branch. The doctrine is rooted in Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, which vests the executive power of the United States in the president. Although that general principle is widely accepted among legal scholars, but not political scientists or public administrators, there is disagreement about the strength and scope of the doctrine. So the writer of this article acts as though this is some sort of extreme stance Donald Trump has taken. This is commonly accepted theory in constitutional law. The critical understanding here is that the statists, the members of the Uniparty, do not want a president to be able to come into office and tear down the federal bureaucracy, the administrative state, all of these career bureaucrats who remain in their positions for decades, executing the agenda of the Uniparty, the agenda of the global regime, regardless of who the president is. It is common knowledge that the administrative state specifically intended to subvert the Donald Trump administration in the first term. Mainstream media figures and our mainstream culture all celebrated this idea that there were all of these people in government who could stop Donald Trump from enacting his agenda, the agenda that the people elected him to enact. Instead, all of this is reconceived as grasping for illegitimate power. Nowhere would that power be more momentous than at the Department of Justice. Since the nation's earliest days, presidents have generally kept a respectful distance from Senate-confirmed law enforcement officials to avoid exploiting for personal ends their enormous ability to curtail Americans' freedoms. But Trump, burned in his first term by multiple investigations directed by his own appointees, is ever more vocal about imposing his will directly on the department and its far-flung investigators and prosecutors. In our Mar-a-Lago interview, Trump says he might fire U.S. attorneys who refuse his orders to prosecute someone. It would depend on the situation. That's the quote from Trump. Is he supposed to make guarantees that he will not fire people, even if they refuse to implement the duly elected president's constitutional agenda? If they don't want to do their jobs, they should resign. If they don't resign, then they must be fired. The fact that unelected bureaucrats would be able to subvert the agenda and the presidency of a duly elected president is the real threat to our system of government and the idea that we have a government at all. There is nothing democratic about a country being run by millions of unelected bureaucrats, educated by the state and then paid by the state. And yes, if they went to a college that receives federal funding, they're basically being educated by the state. Back to the article. He's told supporters he would seek retribution against his enemies in a second term. Would that include Fani Willis, the Atlanta area district attorney who charged him with election interference, or Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA in the Stormy Daniels case, who Trump has previously said should be prosecuted? Trump demurs, but offers no promises. No, I don't want to do that, he says, before adding, we're going to look at a lot of things. What they've done is a terrible thing. Trump has also vowed to appoint a quote-unquote real special prosecutor to go after Biden. I wouldn't want to hurt Biden, he tells me. I have too much respect for the office. Seconds later, though, he suggests Biden's fate may be tied to an upcoming Supreme Court ruling on whether presidents can face criminal prosecution for acts committed in office. If they said that a president doesn't get immunity, says Trump, then Biden, I am sure, will be prosecuted for all of his crimes, end quote. Biden has not been charged with any, and a House Republican effort to impeach him has failed to unearth evidence of any crimes or misdemeanors, high or low. That is just patently false in terms of the evidence, and not being charged for crimes yet does not mean that Biden, in his 5-decade-long career of political corruption, has not committed crimes. These commies are nuts. You make a claim of government corruption, and they say, no, the government isn't corrupt, and the proof is that no one has been charged. Like, yeah, the obvious reason why no one has been charged is because the government is corrupt. Such moves would be potentially catastrophic for the credibility of American law enforcement, scholars and former Justice Department leaders from both parties say. You see that? Unipartisan agreement from scholars and former DOJ officials. They're very concerned about our institutions. If he ordered an improper prosecution, I would expect any respectable U.S. attorney to say no, says Michael McConnell, a former U.S. appellate judge appointed by President George W. Bush. If the president fired the U.S. attorney, it would be an enormous firestorm. McConnell, now a Stanford law professor, says the dismissal could have a cascading effect similar to the Saturday Night Massacre, when President Richard Nixon ordered top DOJ officials to remove the special counsel investigating Watergate. Presidents have the constitutional right to fire U.S. attorneys and typically replace their predecessors' appointees upon taking office. But discharging one specifically for refusing a president's order would be all but unprecedented. And so again, Trump is not allowed to do something that he is constitutionally allowed to do because of my norms. It feels like 2016 again. Trump's radical designs for presidential power would be felt throughout the country. A main focus is at the southern border. Trump says he plans to sign orders to reinstall many of the same policies from his first term, such as the Remain in Mexico program, which requires that non-Mexican asylum seekers be sent south of the border until their court dates, and Title 42, which allows border officials to expel migrants without letting them apply for asylum. Advisors say he plans to cite record border crossings and fentanyl and child trafficking as justification for reimposing the emergency measures. He would direct federal funding to resume construction of the border wall, likely by allocating money from the military budget without congressional approval. The capstone of this program, advisors say, would be a massive deportation operation that would target millions of people. Trump made similar pledges in his first term, but says he plans to be more aggressive in a second. People need to be deported, says Tom Homan, a top Trump advisor and former acting head of immigration and customs enforcement. No one should be off the table. Now, not that public polling is accurate, but it consistently fails in the same direction, and it's not the direction favoring us. Despite that, removing illegal aliens is a majority position in this country now. For an operation of that scale, Trump says he would rely mostly on the National Guard to round up and remove undocumented migrants throughout the country. If they weren't able to, then I'd use other parts of the military, he says. When I ask if that means he would override the Posse Comitatus Act, an 1878 law that prohibits the use of military force on civilians, Trump seems unmoved by the weight of the statute. Well, these aren't civilians, he says. These are people that aren't legally in our country. He would also seek help from local police and says he would deny funding for jurisdictions that decline to adopt his policies. There's a possibility that some won't want to participate, Trump says, and they won't partake in the riches. And let's pause for just a second to notice one of the good things about the fact that the communist infiltration has been so thorough and that the federal government has grown so large and taken control of so many aspects of life in America. With all of those programs out there executing that agenda, receiving federal funding, all Donald Trump has to do is cut off that federal funding for organizations that won't get on board with his agenda. And he has been loud and clear about some of that stuff. There's going to be no federal funding for schools that teach the race agenda or the gender agenda. There will be no federal funding for schools that enforce mask mandates or vaccine mandates. So all of the woke stuff, all of the COVID stuff, the entire vaccine regime will be gone in a second because those schools and universities cannot survive without the federal funding. That's their profit margin. That's what allows them to do all the awful things they do. It should effectively clip the wings of the teachers' unions as well. We will see. But when you have created a system that is almost 100% reliant on federal government funding, and then a president, Donald Trump or whoever else, makes use of their impoundment authorities to stop that money from flowing, if those organizations aren't meeting certain standards, well, that's a whole lot of leverage. These are the sorts of promises that Donald Trump must keep. The money has to stop flowing. And when it does, that whole system collapses. Back to the article. As president, Trump nominated 3 Supreme Court justices who voted to overturn Roe v. Wade, and he claims credit for his role in ending a constitutional right to abortion. There was never a constitutional right to abortion. At the same time, he has sought to diffuse a potent campaign issue for the Democrats by saying he wouldn't sign a federal ban. And of course he won't. The issue is back at the states. That's the entire point. In our interview at Mar-a-Lago, he declines to commit to vetoing any additional federal restrictions if they came to his desk. And why would he do that? There's no point in creating an issue out of this when there is no issue. It is a state's issue now. And if for some reason the American people pushed legislation federally all the way up to Trump and the people wanted it and it was constitutional, why should he commit to vetoing it? More than 20 states now have full or partial abortion bans, and Trump says those policies should be left to the states to do what they want, including monitoring women's pregnancies. I think they might do that, he says. When I ask whether he would be comfortable with states prosecuting women for having abortions beyond the point the laws permit, he says, it's irrelevant whether I'm comfortable or not. It's totally irrelevant because the states are going to make those decisions. President Biden has said he would fight state anti-abortion measures in court and with regulation. An overreaching federal government is an appealing thing to these communists. They want a president to step in and make sure that the states can't decide these things, even though the Supreme Court has already ruled on that. Trump's position is exactly right. He, as president, does not get a say in what the states decide to do about states' issues. Trump's allies don't plan to be passive on abortion if he returns to power. The Heritage Foundation has called for enforcement of a 19th century statute that would outlaw the mailing of abortion pills. The Republican Study Committee, which includes more than 80% of the House GOP conference, included in its 2025 budget proposal the Life at Conception Act, which says the right to life extends to, quote, the moment of fertilization. I asked Trump if he would veto that bill if it came to his desk. I don't have to do anything about vetoes, Trump says, because we now have it back in the states. And you get this sense of desperation. They want to make it a national issue. This writer chooses like 4 different approaches trying to get Trump to say something that could be reframed as a national issue. The answer is this is a states issue. People in the states need to figure this out. The president doesn't have to weigh in on this at all. He has made both his moral and his political position clear, and it is not his issue after that. It is an issue for the states. Presidents typically have a narrow window to pass major legislation. Trump's team is eyeing 2 bills to kick off a second term, a border security and immigration package, and an extension of his 2017 tax cuts. Many of the latter's provisions expire early in 2025. The tax cuts on individual income brackets, 100% business expensing, the doubling of the estate tax deduction. Trump is planning to intensify his protectionist agenda, telling me he's considering a tariff of more than 10% on all imports and perhaps even a 100% tariff on some Chinese goods. Trump says the tariffs will liberate the U.S. economy from being at the mercy of foreign manufacturing and spur an industrial renaissance in the United States. When I point out that independent analysts estimate Trump's first-term tariffs on thousands of products, including steel and aluminum, solar panels, and washing machines, may have cost the U.S. $316 billion and more than 300,000 jobs by one account, he dismisses these experts out of hand. His advisors argue that the average yearly inflation rate in his first term, under 2%, is evidence that his tariffs won't raise prices. And of course, these sorts of complaints should be dismissed out of hand. You don't get to point at one study that seems to violate the laws of economics and common sense and say, look, according to this one study, you're very, very bad and have to change. Since leaving office, Trump has tried to engineer a caucus of the compliant, clearing primary fields in the Senate and House races. His hope is that GOP majorities, replete with MAGA diehards, could rubber stamp his legislative agenda and nominees. Representative Jim Banks of Indiana, a former RSC chairman, that's Republican Study Committee, and the GOP nominee for the state's open Senate seat, recalls an August 2022 RSC planning meeting with Trump at his residence in Bedminster, New Jersey. As the group arrived, Banks recalls news broke that Mar-a-Lago had been raided by the FBI. Banks was sure the meeting would be canceled. Moments later, Trump walked through the doors, defiant and pledging to run again. I need allies there when I'm elected, Banks recalls Trump saying. The difference in a second Trump term, Banks says now, is he's going to have the backup in Congress he didn't have before. Now, let's take just a second here. Donald Trump, in August of 2022, on the same day that the illegitimate administration's DOJ began the Trump documents hoax, current Republican representatives were meeting with Donald Trump at his residence in Bedminster, New Jersey. They traveled to meet Donald Trump. Current congressman went to go see the quote-unquote former president in New Jersey. And then think about the fake president, Joe Biden, who we are told spends most of his time at his Delaware beach house. We don't know anybody who has gone there, essentially, the entire last 3.5 years, because the Secret Service won't release the visitor logs. But for sure, Joe Biden is absolutely, definitely the real president. Trump's intention to remake America's relations abroad may be just as consequential. Since its founding, the U.S. has sought to build and sustain alliances based on the shared values of political and economic freedom. Trump takes a much more transactional approach to international relations than his predecessors, expressing disdain for what he views as free-riding friends and appreciation for authoritarian leaders like President Xi Jinping of China, Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary, or former President Jair Bolsonaro of Brazil. Well, he just calls them effective leaders and effective presidents. He says they are smart. Meanwhile, on the other side, we have Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak and Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz, both of whom, by the way, apparently are married to men. We've got Justin Trudeau, who is the bastard son of Fidel Castro. We've got the criminal Lula down in Brazil, and we have the comedic actor Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine, all of them openly serving at the will and benefit of people like Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum. When you compare that collection of retards to Orban and Bolsonaro and Xi and Putin and Mohammed bin Salman and Narendra Modi and others, there really is no comparison. How should Trump describe these people in relation to their counterparts within the global regime? That's one reason America's traditional allies were horrified when Trump recently said at a campaign rally that Russia could, quote, do whatever the hell they want, end quote, to a NATO country he believes doesn't spend enough on collective defense. That wasn't idle bluster, Trump tells me. If you're not going to pay, then you're on your own, he says. Trump has long said the alliance is ripping the U.S. off. Former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg credited Trump's first-term threat to pull out of the alliance with spurring other members to add more than $100 billion to their defense budgets. So he did exactly the thing he should be doing on behalf of not only America, but NATO. That helps NATO. The United States should not be the world's police force who operates at our own expense to enforce the global regime's control on countries around the world who want nothing to do with the global regime. But an insecure NATO is as likely to accrue to Russia's benefit as it is to America's. He's just making that up. President Vladimir Putin's 2022 invasion of Ukraine looks to many in Europe and the U.S. like a test of his broader vision to reconstruct the Soviet empire. Under Biden and a bipartisan Congress, the U.S. has sent more than $100 billion to Ukraine to defend itself. It's unlikely Trump would extend the same support to Kyiv. After Orban visited Mar-a-Lago in March, he said Trump, quote, wouldn't give a penny, end quote, to Ukraine. I wouldn't give unless Europe starts equalizing, Trump hedges in our interview. If Europe is not going to pay, why should we pay? They're much more greatly affected. We have an ocean in between us. They don't. EU nations have given more than $100 billion in aid to Ukraine as well. Trump has also said he's going to end that conflict in 24 hours, so continuing to fund them is meaningless. Trump has historically been reluctant to criticize or confront Putin. He sided with the Russian autocrat over his own intelligence community when it asserted that Russia interfered in the 2016 election. And that's because Putin was telling the truth and the intelligence community was not. Even now, Trump uses Putin as a foil for his own political purposes. When I asked Trump why he has not called for the release of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who has been unjustly held on spurious charges in a Moscow prison for a year, Trump says, quote, I guess because I have so many other things I'm working on, end quote. Gershkovich should be freed, he adds, but he doubts it will happen before the election. The reporter should be released, and he will be released, Trump tells me. I don't know if he's going to be released under Biden. I would get him released. And of course, that's correct because Joe Biden does not have any leverage. He also does not have a line of communication to Vladimir Putin. And that probably has something to do with the fact that Joe Biden is not a legitimate president or commander in chief. America's Asian allies, like its European ones, may be on their own under Trump. Taiwan's foreign minister recently said aid to Ukraine was critical in deterring Xi from invading the island. Communist China's leaders, quote, have to understand that things like that can't come easy, end quote, Trump says. But he declines to say whether he would come to Taiwan's defense. U.S. policy is that Taiwan is part of China. There will be no coming to Taiwan's defense. Now, that is not to say that the Uniparty won't find ways to give them money, but the idea that China is going to somehow be stopped by the U.S. for invading itself is preposterous. Trump is less cryptic on current U.S. troop deployments in Asia. If South Korea doesn't pay more to support U.S. troops there to deter Kim Jong-un's increasingly belligerent regime to the north, Trump suggests the U.S. could withdraw its forces. We have 40,000 troops that are in a precarious position, he tells Time. The number is actually 28,500. Oh, I got it. So this little commie at Time is going to correct the president on how many troops are over there in Japan. And I guess he has this from the official records. But let's pick back up on that Trump quote. We have 40,000 troops that are in a precarious position, which doesn't make any sense. Why would we defend somebody? And we're talking about a very wealthy country. And he's right. That doesn't make any sense. Why do we have so many occupying forces in so many countries around the world at the same time that we are working as the world's police force on behalf of NATO and the United Nations and the World Economic Forum, the global governing bodies, all executing and implementing the agenda of global bankers? Oh, right. That's why. It's because they need a worldwide police force to do their bidding. And that's where the United States military has come in. And it turns out countries all around the world, large and small, wealthy or poor, are having the U.S. military leave. We discussed that last week as African nations like Niger and Chad are removing the global regime's influence. Transactional isolationism may be the main strain of Trump's foreign policy, but there are limits. Trump says he would join Israel's side in a confrontation with Iran. If they attack Israel, yes, we would be there, he tells me. He says he has come around to the now widespread belief in Israel that a Palestinian state existing side by side in peace is increasingly unlikely. There was a time when I thought two-state could work, he says. Now I think two-state is going to be very, very tough. Well, which state is it going to be? Is it going to be the global regime's proxy state, Israel, that they created 75 years ago? Or is it going to be the Palestinian state that existed there before that's actually recognized by its regional neighbors? Let's see. They've lost Myanmar and Burkina Faso and Chad and Niger. They've lost Guyana. Seems like they've lost Haiti. And these are all small countries. And now we can see they've lost Ukraine. They're almost certain to lose Israel. They're definitely going to lose Taiwan. Things can't be going well in Japan or the Korean Peninsula. Will they hold on to Israel? And is holding on to Israel even the plan? I guess we shall see. It seems like they were setting up to be really focused on Ukraine for a while, but that's not working. Back to the article. Yet even his support for Israel is not absolute. He's criticized Israel's handling of its war against Hamas, which has killed more than 30,000 Palestinians in Gaza and has called for the nation to, quote unquote, get it over with. When I asked whether he would consider withholding U.S. military aid to Israel to push it toward winding down the war, he doesn't say yes, but he doesn't rule it out either. He is sharply critical of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, once a close ally. I had a bad experience with Bibi, Trump says. In his telling, a January 2020 U.S. operation to assassinate a top Iranian general was supposed to be a joint attack until Netanyahu backed out at the last moment. That was something I never forgot, he says. He blames Netanyahu for failing to prevent the October 7th attack, when Hamas militants infiltrated southern Israel and killed nearly 1,200 people amid acts of brutality, including burning entire families alive and raping women and girls. It happened on his watch, Trump says. It's weird that this writer doesn't mention the paragliding go-karts. On the second day of Trump's New York trial on April 17th, I stand behind the packed counter of the Sanaa convenience store on 139th Street and Broadway, waiting for Trump to drop in for a post-court campaign stop. He chose the bodega for its history. In 2022, one of the store's clerks fatally stabbed a customer who attacked him. Bragg, the Manhattan DA, charged the clerk with second-degree murder. The charges were later dropped amid public outrage over video footage that appeared to show the clerk acting in self-defense. A baseball bat behind the counter alludes to lingering security concerns. When Trump arrives, he asks the store's co-owner, Maad Ahmed, a Yemeni immigrant, about safety. You should be allowed to have a gun, Trump tells Ahmed. If you had a gun, you'd never get robbed. And yeah, he should obviously be allowed to have a gun. On the campaign trail, Trump uses crime as a cudgel, painting urban America as a savage hellscape, even though violent crime has declined in recent years, with homicides sinking 6% in 2022 and 13% in 2023, according to the FBI. You see that? He's got numbers, and his numbers refute what everyone has experienced in real life. Trust the experts, trust the science, trust the state. When I point this out, Trump tells me he thinks the data, which is collected by state and local police departments, is rigged. It's a lie, he says. He has pledged to send the National Guard into cities struggling with crime in a second term, possibly without the request of governors, and plans to approve Justice Department grants only to cities that adopt his preferred policing methods like stop and frisk. And again, as we discussed a few minutes ago, the system being so reliant on federal funding actually gives Trump a lot of leverage. This works great for them when they have a Uniparty president in place, but it's a disaster if anyone from outside the Uniparty takes on that role. To critics, Trump's preoccupation with crime is a racial dog whistle. In polls, large numbers of his supporters have expressed the view that anti-white racism now represents a greater problem in the U.S. than the systemic racism that has long afflicted Black Americans. When I ask if he agrees, Trump does not dispute this position. There is a definite anti-white feeling in the country, he tells Time, and that can't be allowed either. That is 100% true. It just is true. It is absolutely everywhere in popular culture, and it is promoted constantly by the mainstream media. It is even promoted by the federal government. In a second term, advisors say a Trump administration would rescind Biden's executive orders designed to boost diversity and racial equity. Yes, because that's discrimination. Trump's ability to campaign for the White House in the midst of an unprecedented criminal trial is the product of a more professional campaign operation that has avoided the infighting that plagued past versions. He has a very disciplined team around him, says Representative Elise Stefanik of New York. That is an indicator of how disciplined and focused a second term will be. That control now extends to the party writ large. In 2016, the GOP establishment, having failed to derail Trump's campaign, surrounded him with staff who sought to temper him. Today, the party's permanent class have either devoted themselves to the gospel of MAGA or given up. Trump has cleaned house at the Republican National Committee, installing hand-picked leaders, including his daughter-in-law, who have reportedly imposed loyalty tests on prospective job applicants, asking whether they believe the false assertion that the 2020 election was stolen. The RNC has denied there is a litmus test. Trump tells me he would have trouble hiring anyone who admits Biden won. I wouldn't feel good about it, Trump said. And yeah, that is the most obvious position to possibly be taken. Policy groups are creating a government in waiting full of true believers. The Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 has drawn up plans for legislation and executive orders as it trains prospective personnel for a second Trump term. The Center for Renewing America, led by Russell Vought, Trump's former director of the Office of Management and Budget, is dedicated to disempowering the so-called administrative state, the collection of bureaucrats with the power to control everything from drug safety determinations to the contents of school lunches. The America First Policy Institute is a research haven of pro-Trump right-wing populists. America First Legal, led by Trump's immigration advisor Stephen Miller, is mounting court battles against the Biden administration. The goal of these groups is to put Trump's vision into action on day one. The president never had a policy process that was designed to give him what he actually wanted and campaigned on, says Vought. We are sorting through the legal authorities, the mechanics, and providing the momentum for a future administration. That includes a litany of boundary-pushing right-wing policies, including slashing Department of Justice funding and cutting climate and environmental regulations. Trump's campaign says he would be the final decision-maker on which policies suggested by these organizations would get implemented. But at the least, these advisors could form the front lines of a planned march against what Trump dubs the deep state, marrying bureaucratic savvy to their leaders' anti-bureaucratic zeal. One weapon in Trump's second term, war on Washington, is a wonky one, restoring the power of impoundment, which allows presidents to withhold congressionally appropriated funds. Impoundment was a favorite maneuver of Nixon, who used his authority to freeze funding for subsidized housing and the Environmental Protection Agency. Trump and his allies plan to challenge a 1974 law that prohibits use of the measure, according to campaign policy advisors. You gotta wonder if that's one of the things that made the deep state want to take down Nixon. Another inside move is the enforcement of Schedule F, which allows the president to fire non-political government officials and which Trump says he would embrace. You have some people that are protected that shouldn't be protected, he says. A senior U.S. judge offers an example of how consequential such a move would be. Suppose there's another pandemic and President Trump wants to push the use of an untested drug, much as he did with hydroxychloroquine during COVID-19. And hydroxychloroquine is plenty tested. It was even recommended by regime doctors as a solution before they decided to go full bore at the very deadly pandemic. The sleight of hand here exists in the idea that COVID-19 was a brand new thing, a brand new virus. They would have to test each one of these drugs individually for that, and that would take years. Not like a vaccine featuring entirely experimental technology. They can just give that out as soon as they produce it. Under Schedule F, if the drug's medical reviewer at the FDA refuses to sign off on its use, Trump could fire them and anyone else who doesn't approve it. The Trump team says the president needs the power to hold bureaucrats accountable to voters. The mere mention of Schedule F, says Vought, ensures that the bureaucracy moves in your direction. Now, if Trump fired a member of the FDA who wouldn't approve a certain drug, and there was not substantial support for Trump's position, well, that might damage Trump in the eyes of the public. But it's still necessary that Trump as president has that power, because what we were left with instead is that hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin were prevented by the FDA from being used for sick Americans. All of this might be made moot by the Chevron decision if the power of these agencies to set standards and enforce regulations and the rest of it is eliminated by the Supreme Court. It can be hard at times to discern Trump's true intentions. In his interviews with Time, he often sidestepped questions or answered them in contradictory ways. There's no telling how his ego and self-destructive behavior might hinder his objectives. And for all his norm-breaking, there are lines he says he won't cross. When asked if he would comply with all orders upheld by the Supreme Court, Trump says he would. It is disgraceful that these millennial communists go on talking about Trump's ego and self-destructive behavior when they claim that he sidesteps questions or answers them in contradictory fashion just because they don't understand anything about what anyone believes unless that person is just repeating elements of the central narrative. Almost everything Trump says exists outside of this communist's understanding of reality. So, of course, it doesn't make sense to him. But none of what he has described so far has even hinted that Trump is somehow going to usurp illegitimate authority, undue authority, go beyond the authority and powers of his office, or violate in any way the Constitution. All of this, in their minds, is results-oriented. Trump might ruin their program. Therefore, what he is doing must be unlawful. It must be unconstitutional. It must be just a power grab and nothing more. Otherwise, they would have to admit that what they have built up is built on nothing and can and should be torn down, and that it's legal and constitutional and necessary to tear it all down. But back to the article. We are quickly approaching the end. But his policy preoccupations are clear and consistent. If Trump is able to carry out a fraction of his goals, the impact could prove as transformative as any presidency in more than a century. He's in full war mode, says his former advisor and occasional confidant, Steve Bannon. Trump's sense of the state of the country is, quote unquote, quite apocalyptic, Bannon says. That's where Trump's heart is. That's where his obsession is. And that is true of Trump's base of MAGA supporters as well. These obsessions could once again push the nation to the brink of crisis. We are already in a crisis, commie. Settle down. It's gonna be okay. We will take it from here. You just shh forever, okay? Trump does not dismiss the possibility of political violence around the election. If we don't win, it depends, he tells Time. It always depends on the fairness of the election. When I ask what he meant when he baselessly claimed on Truth Social that a stolen election, quote, allows for the termination of all rules, regulations, and articles, even those found in the Constitution, end quote, Trump responded by denying he had said it. He then complained about the Biden-inspired court case he faces in New York and suggested that the quote-unquote fascists within America's government were its greatest threat. I think the enemy from within, in many cases, is much more dangerous for our country than the outside enemies of China, Russia, and various others, he tells me. And all of MAGA world agrees with that, too. Any normal person, by this point, should agree with that. Toward the end of our conversation at Mar-a-Lago, I asked Trump to explain another troubling comment he made, that he wants to be a dictator for a day. It came during a Fox News town hall with Sean Hannity, who gave Trump an opportunity to allay concerns that he would abuse power in office or seek retribution against political opponents. Trump said he would not be a dictator, except for day one. I want to close the border and I want to drill. Trump says that the remark, quote, was said in fun, in jest, sarcastically, end quote. He compares it to an infamous moment from the 2016 campaign when he encouraged the Russians to hack and leak Hillary Clinton's emails. In Trump's mind, the media sensationalized those remarks too. But the Russians weren't joking. Among many other efforts to influence the core exercise of American democracy that year, they hacked the DNC's servers and disseminated its emails through WikiLeaks. That is a baseless claim for which there is no evidence. That is patently false. This communist has no idea of that, of course, but that is ridiculous. Whether or not he was kidding about bringing a tyrannical end to our 248-year experiment in democracy, I ask him, don't you see why many Americans see such talk of dictatorship as contrary to our most cherished principles? Trump says no, quite the opposite. He insists, quote, I think a lot of people like it, end quote. Imagine hearing a guy joke on national television saying that he wants to be dictator for one day. Imagine hearing that and reframing that as, and this is a quote from the article that you just heard me read, bringing a tyrannical end to our 248-year experiment in democracy. Yes, these people are losing their minds. They are panicking. They are melting down. Again, everything laid out here is popular with the American people and constitutional and lawful and something the president is allowed to do, if not directed to do. This is an America First agenda. This is why the country will elect Donald Trump for a third time. And if he doesn't implement this agenda successfully, then the American people will be there, including his own supporters, to hold him to account and keep the America First movement plowing ahead. I'll be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under $0.25 per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree. Linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's